Levi Brackman here with the fourth season of this podcast. Thank you so much for joining. This is also the 51st episode. So we've been doing this podcast for a while and it's evolved over time. I want to talk about what the podcast is today, what it is, who it's for, and what it will do. So first of all, what is this podcast? Well, it started off as me trying to share some wisdom for business. Then that turned into wisdom for business and life. Then realizing that there was a Jewish bent to everything as a rabbi and a Judaic scholar, I realized that there was a Jewish perspective on a lot of what I was bringing, and therefore it became Jewish wisdom for business and life. And then over time, I realized this wasn't just about for business and life. We were talking about philosophical ideas. We were talking about ideas related to the ultimate questions. We were talking about spirituality. Lots of different topics. So I've now also changed the name and I've called it Truths. Now this is a working name. It might change again over time, but I want to talk about why I've called it Truths. Jewish Wisdom for Today is the working name of the podcast currently. The reason why I've called it Truths is because if you would remember and you listened to a previous episode, I spoke about how in my own evolution of Judaism and of religion and of spirituality and my own philosophy in life, I've came to realize that in fact what religions offer aren't the truth but are truths. And there's a big difference between the truth and truths. And I feel that in many ways that, when we had the scientific revolution over the last few hundred years, religion felt that it needed to keep up with science and needed to compete with science. So for many years, religious people thought that they had to steer their audience into the religious way of thinking and away from the scientific way of thinking. And in order to do that, they had to say that Judaism or religion was the truth, just like science is the truth. And as a matter of fact, they tried to argue that their religion was in many ways more of the truth then science was more of the truth. And I understand exactly why the religious and spiritual leaders of past generations did this, but I think it was a big blunder, a big mistake. And the reason for that is because these are two different genres. Science and religion really are not the same genre. As a matter of fact, I would argue that religion never tried to compete with science. And the story of creation, for example, was never supposed to be a scientific account of how the world came into being. And all the stories of the Bible, all the teachings of the Bible, all the teachings of religion were never meant to be scientific in nature. They were never meant to tell you exactly how things came into being and exactly how things are. They were much more of a moral teaching. And moral teachings are truths rather than the truth. So I want to talk a little bit about this because it's worth focusing on why I've chosen to this name of Truths. So I refer often back to Maimonides. Maimonides was the arch rationalist, the great Jewish thinker and philosopher and halachist from back in the 12th century. And he wrote this book called The Guide to the Perplexed, one of my favorite books ever. I've read it multiple times. And in the beginning of the guide, he asks the following biblical question. So he goes back to the story of Adam, the primordial man, and he says, Adam, when he was first created, in the story, he sinned, and he ate from the tree of knowledge. And when he ate from the tree of knowledge, he was immediately punished. And the punishment was that all of a sudden, he was able to know the difference between good and evil. Maimonides immediately asked the question, what kind of punishment is that? That doesn't seem like a punishment at all. Because if previously he didn't have the knowledge of good and evil, and now he has that knowledge, he's now gained something, not lost something. And punishments are usually associated with losing something, not with gaining something. So therefore Maimonides explains that, as a matter of fact, this acquisition of knowledge between good and bad was associated with a loss. Because previously, Adam had the ability to discern truth. And that ability to discern truth was taken away from him when he sinned. And then he was given instead a inferior type of knowledge, which was the ability to discern between good and evil. So the idea here is, though, that the ability to actually discern ultimate truths was something which Adam didn't have. As a matter of fact, the whole thing which he had was the ability to discern moral truths, not the ultimate truth. And this is actually a teaching which is really important to understand, that the whole idea of what humans have today, our ability to cognize, etc., is more about being able to reach moral truths rather than the truth. Humans don't really have the ability to know the ultimate of truth. That's not something we actually can ever grasp. What science did was it gave us an ability to approximate based on statistical foundations of what's more probable to be true and what's probably not true. And using the scientific method, we can actually reach different degrees of certainty of whether something is true or not true. And I've discussed this in this podcast. Actually, even science doesn't make truth claims. All science really does is it says that this hypothesis is more likely to be the case than an alternative hypothesis. But it doesn't make truth claims either. So even science doesn't make truth claims. Religion also doesn't make truth claims. Religion tells you stories which help you discern truths, moral truths, mainly truths that can help you in your life, and things to think about, and ideas to make choices about when you lack actual hard knowledge. So the two different realms. Religion is not the realm of trying to discern the truth in the way science is, or probabilities of what actual hypothesis is the case rather than the alternative hypothesis. It's more there on the realm of, this is trying to teach you truths about how to live your life, and all the stories that which are told are in service of trying to teach you truths about how to live your life and how to make decisions in the face of uncertainty, rather than to tell you the truth. Now, if religion had actually been honest about that and hadn't tried to compete with science, I would argue a misunderstanding of what science was trying to do, then they would never have made these claims of being the truth, and then having to defend these claims of being the truth, which obviously in the end become totally indefensible. And therefore I felt that it would be good, since a lot of the ideas that I'm going to be sharing in this podcast come from religion, come from philosophy, and philosophy is, between, if you think about the hierarchy, you've got science, which is trying to discern the physical realities. You've got philosophy, which is trying to figure out in between what's going on, philosophizing about what might be without the actual physical evidence. And then you've got religion, which is there in the place where you can't have either, and you've got things to believe in. So that's, I think, a good way of thinking about it. But a lot of the ideas, even the philosophy which I talk about in this podcast, is very much related to, from a Jewish perspective, and comes from a moral understanding. And therefore, we're going to call this truths. So truths rather than the truth. And we're not here to share the truth of anything, because, as I said, I think the truth is itself almost impossible for humans to actually reach. Now, obviously, there are certain things which are, this is not, just to be clear, this isn't to say that there is a moral equivalency between everything and everything can be true. That's not the case. There are certain things which we know from factual evidence, and we have an alternate hypothesis over the null hypothesis to know with high degree of certainty that one thing is more likely than the other. So here I'm not saying that there's no truth in the sense that everything is fair game, because it's not. And I certainly don't believe that. But certainly in the level, in what we're coming from, is we're not trying to spout the truth, but we're trying to talk about truths. Okay, so that's the name of the podcast, and it's from a Jewish perspective, and trying to make it relevant for today, and therefore I'm calling it Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. So that's the name of the podcast. Again, it's a working name, subject to change if we come up with a better and more catchy name. Now, who is this podcast for? If you are a person who doesn't like nuance, you're not going to enjoy this podcast. If you're a person who wants absolutes, then you probably have kind of figured out, and I've probably lost you anyway in the first part of this preamble. So if you're a person who likes absolutes, this podcast isn't for you. However, if you're a person who kind of gets nuance, and admittedly, that's the minority of people, I don't think that this podcast is going to have mass appeal. And I would be very surprised if it ends up having mass appeal, because this podcast is all about nuance. And if we're honest about it, most people don't get nuance. Most people, they want to be on the fringes. We have this bifurcation of society, each one going to their own corners, and the more absolute, the more bombastic, the better for them. That's not what this podcast is for. This is also not a podcast of religious leaders or religious gurus. So there I have no intention and never had any intention of becoming a person who people follow and people come to and look up to, etc. That's none of that. This is a podcast for fellow travelers. People who are thinking individuals who want to better their lives, want to go through a process of some type of self-improvement, gain understanding, become a better person, gain wisdom, and just seek. It's for the seeker. It's for the fellow traveler, the person who's trying to figure it all out. We live in a very, very complex world. We live in a world where things are actually getting more and more complex. And a lot of the old ways of thinking about things, a lot of the old ways of answering questions just are simply no longer relevant anymore. You can look at some of the old ancient texts and they do have wisdom in them and there are timeless truths in them, but also the way they dealt with things are no longer relevant because things in the universe, in science, in technology have evolved so quickly. Our knowledge has caught up, not just caught up, has evolved, not just evolved, it's the wrong word, has accelerated. That's the right word. Our knowledge has accelerated so quickly that, and circumstances have changed. Look at just of the last 6 months, what's happened with AI has called into question everything associated with how we think about what it means to actually be human. The whole concept of the soul, if that wasn't something which was challenging to begin with, has become even more challenging as we've thought about AI and other types of consciousness, non-human consciousnesses and non-human intelligence. All these things have thrown into question not just decades, but centuries upon centuries, thousands of years of thinking have been thrown into question, where the old ways of looking at things and the old answers that were given no longer work today. Now there are people who want to put their heads in the sand and ignore that as if it isn't there. There are those people who want to say that the ancients were the people who understood everything and the answers are all in the books of the ancients. That's not our position here with this podcast. Our position is that the way things have evolved, the way knowledge has accelerated, the way technology has accelerated over the last number of years, it demands a new way of thinking about things. It demands new truths. It demands asking questions in a different way and being honest about the things that no longer work and how we can now navigate as we move forward as humanity, as humans, as spiritual beings to try and get to the next level. So that is really what this podcast is and what it's for. It's for people who are seeking the nuance inherent in these things. Not just simple answers which have been given in the past, but new ideas and that nuanced position which can help one move forward. It's for people who are thinking along these lines, who are troubled by what we're seeing in the body politic, troubled by the bifurcation on all levels of society where people are running to their two extremes. This is for people who want to be in the middle and understand the nuance, understand that things aren't just black and white, and understand that we need to bring new ways of thinking to bear to old problems, and that new problems which have come up and new challenges need to be dealt with in new ways. Now, I admit again that that's a minority of the population. This isn't lots of people who are bothered or troubled by these things or want to discuss these things. But for that minority of the population which does, I believe that you'll find a home in this podcast. Now, the other thing which I wanted to talk about is, what does this podcast do? So what does it do? Well, two things: learning and sharing. So first of all, from a very selfish perspective, if you like, I would like to learn from some of the great people out there. And there are many of them. And I intend to invite them onto this podcast. We got already a list of people who I've invited, and we will grow that list. So I'm looking for people who I can learn from. So I'm inviting people onto this podcast who've thought things through, who've gone through a journey of their own, and have something to share, which I can learn from. And then hopefully, which the audience can also learn from. So that's the number one. It's about me learning, and hopefully the audience learning from these people as well. And then also sharing that I have gone through this journey on my own as well. And I've evolved. In a previous episode, I've described my evolution, my spiritual evolution. And I'd like to share that journey with others as well as we go along, because I think it might be helpful. So it's about learning and sharing. So I, as the host, will try and share as much as I can. Some people friends of mine have challenged me to share more. And I'll try as much as I can to be open and vulnerable about where I am in all these things. But the main thing is not about sharing about me and my life and who I am, but rather the learnings and experiences and the wisdom that I have gained from multiple evolutions along this journey. So it's for fellow travelers who want to travel along with me and with my guests. That's what this podcast is all about. So I hope that you will join me. Next week, we'll have our first guest on this podcast. And we have, I won't share the names yet. They'll come up, but I'm sure you will not be disappointed. But that's what this podcast is all about. Again, this is Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today is the name of the podcast. It will have a new format. And sometimes, again, it will just be me sharing. But mostly, I will bring in guests to have conversations about ideas that matter, people to share their experiences, their journeys, their teachings, their wisdom. I'm really, really excited about this. I'm really glad that you are going to be along for the ride.